My name is Lucas. At my younger brother's wedding, my father raised a toast and called me a disappointment. A man who installs security cameras and doesn't fly high like my brother. The whole room laughed until our old neighbor stood up and revealed I'd donated $1 million to change the lives of over 200 struggling kids. Suddenly, everyone went quiet, even my father. The wedding was held at a resort outside Scottsdale, all beige stone and desert cactus arrangements, the kind of place where people whispered about wealth through their fashion instead of words. I stepped out of my rental car, adjusted my plain suit, and took a deep breath. The valet didn't even look at me twice. Inside, everything smelled like roses and champagne. People buzzed in designer shoes floating between polished wood floors and string quartet melodies. I caught a few faces turned toward me, eyes flicking from my scuffed shoes to my off-the-rack suit. Their nods were polite but distant, as if I was someone's hired help who got invited by mistake. My mother, Julia, gave me a soft hug near the entrance, her eyes warm and tired. She squeezed my hand briefly. "You look great," she whispered. I knew she meant it. She always did. Then he appeared. My father, Thomas Bennett, still trim in his 60s, silver hair slicked back, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my car. His arm looped around Charlotte, my brother's soon-to-be wife, as they made their way across the reception hall. He didn't greet me, didn't nod, just glanced over me like I was furniture. Derek spotted me and smiled, arms open. "Lucas, you made it." I smiled back, shook his hand. He pulled me into a brief hug, clapped my back, and moved on before I could say much else. His day, after all. I kept mostly to the edges. Waiters glided by with trays of sparkling wine, which I declined. Conversations bloomed around stock portfolios and new startups. I stood beside a potted palm, watching, listening. I wasn't bitter, not anymore, just outside, like always. Dinner came. White tablecloths, tall candles, 5-piece silverware arrangements. I found my place card at the last table, tucked near the kitchen door. Charlotte's friends and some older guests sat around me. Nobody asked me anything. They talked about real estate in Manhattan and private schools in Palo Alto. Then came the toast. My father stood up, glass in hand. The room hushed. He spoke warmly about Derek, about his achievements in law, his discipline, his clear vision of leadership. He talked about how proud he was of Derek, how everything he built was a result of years of guidance and family values. And then his eyes met mine. "And Lucas," he said, pausing just a moment too long, "Lucas has chosen a different path. He's a security systems engineer at the county level. That's respectable. Not everyone can be a high flyer." There was a ripple of polite laughter. Someone actually coughed to cover it. My ears buzzed. My mouth stayed shut. I stared down at the linen napkin in my lap, folded perfectly like everything else in this place. Perfect, but disposable. Nobody looked at me after that. Not really. I wasn't angry. I'd expected something like that, but somehow hearing it in that moment in front of everyone still punched the air out of me. I took a sip of water, steadying my hand. I didn't look back at him. Didn't let my face show a thing. Let him have his moment. I used to think maybe one day he'd see me. Not just look at me, but really see me. As a kid, I held on to that hope like a lifeline. Growing up in Chandler, Arizona, our house always felt like a stage with a spotlight fixed on Derek. My father made sure of it. Derek the prodigy. Derek the debate champion. Derek who got his acceptance letter to Stanford framed and hung in the hallway like it was a family heirloom. Every dinner conversation revolved around his latest triumph. If I got an A, Derek had already aced the final. If I won a small science fair, Derek had shaken hands with the mayor. I wasn't jealous, I was just invisible. I built tree houses, fixed broken sprinklers, took apart old computers from garage sales and rewired them just to see if I could. My mom noticed. She always did. She'd sneak me extra dessert and whisper that she was proud. I think she was the only reason I didn't disappear entirely. By high school, the gap between us was a canyon. Derek wore tailored blazers to his internship at a law firm. I worked nights at a hardware store saving up to buy my own car. My father never said anything cruel directly. He didn't need to. Disappointment hung in the air like cologne. Senior year, he sat me down one evening in his office, a place filled with shelves of law books and plaques engraved with his name. He slid a brochure across the table. Pre-law track at UC Irvine. UC. It's not Stanford, but it's solid. You're still young. You can course correct. I told him I'd enlisted. The silence that followed felt like stepping into a vacuum. He didn't yell. He didn't ask why. He just nodded once slowly, then stood and left the room. The next morning, he didn't join us for breakfast. For the rest of that summer, he barely spoke to me. Boot camp was a relief. No expectations beyond survival. No comparison. Just grit, sweat, and a bunk to collapse into every night. I made it through 6 years in the Marines. Served overseas, handled logistics, and led a unit that managed civilian infrastructure in unstable zones. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. I sent postcards home. My mother wrote back. My father didn't. When I finally returned, Arizona felt smaller somehow. Derek had passed the bar, gotten engaged, and joined Dad's investment firm. I didn't want to be in their shadow again. So I moved to Colorado and started fresh. Security systems had always interested me. Not just the tech, but the psychology of them. The way people feel safe because of invisible boundaries. I joined a small civic engineering company in Boulder that specialized in public safety infrastructure. We did everything from school surveillance setups to emergency alert systems for senior centers. I loved the work. I loved seeing things function because of my hands, my plans. It wasn't flashy, but it helped people sleep better at night. It was the first time in a long time I felt like I was building something that couldn't be taken from me. Still, every now and then I'd wonder if he knew, if he cared, if he had any clue what I'd chosen to be instead of what he'd mapped out for me. Not because I wanted praise, but because some small part of me still ached for acknowledgement. That ache was still there, quiet and dull, as I sat in that banquet hall, pretending the clink of forks and champagne glasses didn't bother me. I watched Derek lean into Charlotte, his laughter rich and effortless, and I remembered the boy who once shared bunk beds with me, trading secrets late into the night before he decided I wasn't worth his time. A waiter brushed past me, murmuring a soft apology as he placed a plate of filet mignon in front of me. I nodded, offered a faint smile, then looked across the table at the empty conversation. I cut into my food without tasting it, counting the minutes until I could leave without drawing attention. But I stayed. Not for them. For her. My mother had asked me to be here. So I was. As always, showing up quietly in the background, steady and unseen, let him have his moment. I'd had my own, just in places no one else had looked. In the early spring, after I moved to Denver, I found myself in a place that barely made it onto city maps. It was the kind of neighborhood people only talked about in statistics. High crime rate, low graduation rate, limited funding. The Denver Housing Coalition had contracted our firm to update the community's outdated security system. Most engineers on our team saw it as a side job. I didn't. I met the director of the local youth center, Mrs. Rivas, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who didn't waste words. She showed me around with a quiet urgency. 2 break-ins in 3 months, she said, pointing to a busted back door still held shut with a metal rod. One happened during tutoring hours. The kids were here. That stuck with me. The center was old but full of life. Kids practicing hip-hop moves in a rec room with torn mats. A library with books held together by tape and willpower. Staff that worked overtime without pay. The place breathed resistance. I spent a week mapping every entry point, checking the integrity of doors and windows, and installing a new network of cameras and motion sensors. Most of it was covered by the grant. What wasn't, I paid for myself. I didn't tell anyone. One evening, long after my crew had gone home, I stayed behind to finish wiring a section of the exterior wall. The sun had dipped and the lot outside was empty except for a few old bikes chained to a fence. I was tightening a cable when a boy around 12 peeked around the corner. "You work here?" he asked, cautious. "Kind of. I'm just helping out." He nodded, stepping closer. "My brother says cameras are just so cops can watch us." I smiled. "Your brother's not totally wrong, but these are to keep you safe so your tutoring doesn't get interrupted again." He looked at the mounted dome camera, then at me. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lucas." He paused. "I'm Jordan." We shook hands. His grip was small but firm. Then he pointed at my toolbox. "That a torque driver?" I blinked. "It is. You know tools," he shrugged. "My uncle used to fix motorcycles. He taught me some stuff. Want to help me finish this?" He hesitated, then nodded. We spent the next 20 minutes connecting wires, drilling mount points, and labeling ports. He asked smart questions, paid attention, didn't flinch at the work. When we finished, he stepped back and looked up at the camera like it meant something. "You think this'll stop them from coming back?" he asked. "Maybe not completely, but it'll slow them down, and it shows that someone cares." He didn't say anything else, just gave me a little nod and walked off into the dusk. The next week, the center hosted a small reopening event. Mrs. Rivas had somehow convinced a local news station to cover it. They asked me for a quote. I said no. I wasn't there for that. Still, the segment aired on Channel 7. The anchor called me a quiet hero. My name showed up on screen for 3 seconds. My phone buzzed once with a congratulatory message from a coworker. That was it. I didn't hear from my family, not that I expected to. They didn't watch local Denver news. But part of me wondered what my father would have said if he'd seen it. If he'd recognized that the security system at a rundown youth center mattered just as much as courtroom victories or hedge fund deals. Maybe he wouldn't have said anything. Maybe that silence would have said everything. I kept the photo from that night, though. Someone had snapped it with an old Nikon. Me and Jordan crouched beside a mounted panel, both grinning like we'd just hacked into NASA. I kept it tucked in a drawer at my apartment, just to remind myself. Not every impact is loud. Some of it lives in quiet corners and secondhand smiles. Grace came into my life like most important things do, unexpectedly and right in the middle of a storm. It was during a fundraiser for a nonprofit I had helped set up security systems for. They provided job training and legal aid to formerly incarcerated teens. The organization wanted no spotlight on individual donors or engineers, which suited me. I preferred to stay out of sight. But someone had tipped off the press. Grace Taylor was the reporter assigned to cover the story. She was tall with sharp eyes and a notebook always half full. We spoke briefly after the event, her questions more insightful than probing. She didn't ask why I chose to do the work. She asked what it felt like to change a life quietly. I didn't have an answer. I think that's what made her remember me. We met again a week later. She invited me for coffee under the pretense of clarifying a quote, but no tape recorder ever appeared. We talked for 2 hours about everything except the project. Politics, books, our parents. The way silence can either be a shield or a sentence. One conversation became 3. 3 became dinner. Dinner became weekends. She made me laugh in ways I forgot I could. She didn't care about my last name. Didn't care that I didn't own a tailored suit. She asked about the youth centers. The tools I used, the stories I never shared out loud. For the first time in a long while, I let someone in. But letting someone in meant letting go of the walls I had built, and those walls were part of my armor. I never told her how much money I donated, never told her about the deal I made with the foundation to stay anonymous. But I think she knew. Grace was the kind of woman who could read a room before she stepped into it. Still, she never pushed. One evening, while we were walking near Wash Park, she mentioned Peter Langford, said he was an old mentor of hers in journalism school who now chaired a large charitable board. "You two should meet," she said. "He's smart and quiet, like you." I shrugged it off, but a week later she made the introduction. Peter was in his 70s, soft-spoken but intense, the kind of man who looked through you instead of at you. We met over lunch in an old cafe downtown, the kind with laminated menus and no music. Grace had told him about my projects, about the youth centers, about how I refused recognition. He nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "Why do you hide?" I didn't answer, just stirred my coffee. He smiled like he expected that. After that meeting, things accelerated. Peter offered to connect me with a broader network of nonprofits. He never asked for credit. He only asked that I stay true to the reasons I started. He respected silence. Grace and I continued quietly for a while. She never tried to publish a story, never asked for access. But I began to feel the pull. Every time someone from her newsroom waved at us in a restaurant, every time her phone buzzed with an assignment about public policy or corporate scandal, I felt the weight of what I was hiding. She deserved someone who didn't have a secret name behind every act of kindness. She deserved a partner, not a shadow. So I ended it, on a cold Tuesday night outside her apartment. She didn't cry. She just nodded, arms crossed, eyes steady. "You're not protecting me," she said. "You're protecting a version of yourself that doesn't need to exist anymore." I watched her close the door. I stood there for 10 more minutes before walking away. Peter called the next day. He didn't ask about Grace. He simply said, "We'll keep building. When you're ready for more, I'll be here." And he was. In early 2019, Peter invited me to his home in Boulder. I remembered the house vaguely from childhood, back when he lived next door to us in Chandler and used to bring over fresh lemons from his backyard tree. The Boulder version was older, quieter, tucked behind a stone wall lined with ivy and a mailbox that leaned to the left. We sat in his sunroom, both of us nursing mugs of coffee. He wore a cardigan and old slippers. I wore the same boots I used at job sites. The silence between us was comfortable. "I've been watching your work," he said finally. "You've made a bigger impact than you realize." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He handed me a folder. Inside were plans for a program he'd been sketching for years. A vocational pathway for at-risk youth, especially those with criminal records. The idea was to train them in security technology, both hardware and systems. Teach them how to build, install, repair, give them a trade, a purpose. He said, "I've got the reach, you've got the blueprint." We spent the next 3 months turning his idea into reality. I wrote the curriculum, drawing from my military background and field experience. He handled logistics, funding, and legal barriers. Together, we formed the Secure Futures Initiative under the Langford Foundation. We started small, just one center in Aurora, 10 students, one instructor, me. They were kids who didn't trust anyone. Most were quiet, guarded. A few were defiant. But by week 3, they were showing up early, staying late, asking about voltage resistance and circuit logic. They wanted to learn. They just needed someone to show up first. Peter came to every quarterly meeting, never interrupted, just listened. After the second session, I told him I wanted to fund a full expansion. I had the money, years of saved earnings, investments, and bonuses I never touched. I want it to grow, I said. But my name doesn't go on anything. He didn't ask why. He just nodded. We structured the donation through a blind trust. $1 million spread across 4 years, enough to build 2 more centers and pay for instructors' materials and student stipends. No press, no plaque. Peter respected that. But he always made sure I saw the reports, graduation rates, job placements, letters from students. He kept them in a file labeled Quiet Victories. Sometimes I'd drop by the centers unannounced, pretend I was there for a wiring inspection, watch from a distance as someone explained how to run a power audit or debug a control panel. I never corrected them when they called me Mr. Lucas. Never told them I was the reason the lights stayed on. Peter would call occasionally just to check in. He never pried, but I could hear it in his voice. He was proud. One day over lunch he said, "You remind me of someone." "Who's that?" "Me 30 years ago. Except you're quieter and more stubborn." I laughed. "Maybe, but you were brave enough to put your name on things." He looked at me serious. "That's not always bravery. Sometimes it's ego." I thought about that all the way home. The next month, the Aurora Center had its first full-class graduate. 7 out of 10 placed into jobs within 6 weeks. One of them emailed Peter a thank you note and said he wanted to come back as an instructor someday. Peter forwarded it to me without a subject line, just the message: "You were part of this." The laughter at the wedding sounded like clinking glass and polished shoes on marble, all a little too bright, too rehearsed. I stood near the edge of the crowd, champagne in hand, trying to keep my expression neutral. If I could have left right then without disappointing Mom, I would have. I hadn't seen Derek since the rehearsal dinner. He was busy soaking in the glory of a wedding that looked like it had been pulled from a bridal magazine. White orchids, gold runners, a string quartet playing Coldplay covers. Charlotte, his new wife, wore a custom gown that shimmered when she turned. They made their way around the room, stopping at each table with practiced grace. When they finally reached mine, Charlotte didn't bother with a smile. "Lucas," she said, nodding. "You found the place all right," I nodded. "Congratulations. Everything looks beautiful." She tilted her head slightly. "You know there's a table near the kitchen where the catering crew is sitting? I thought maybe you'd be more comfortable there. You know, being in security and all. Hands-on work." Derek chuckled softly, eyes flicking to her, then to me. Some guests around us gave polite laughs, the kind that cut more than they entertained. I took a slow sip of my drink, held her gaze, then looked at Derek. "Nice suit," I said. "Did Dad pick it out?" Charlotte's smile flickered. Derek shifted his weight. Silence crept into the space between us, thick and awkward. I didn't need to respond the way they expected. Didn't need to make a scene. I remembered what Mom said before I flew in. You don't have to prove anything, just be there. So I was. Charlotte excused herself with a polite smile and tugged Derek along. I watched them disappear into the next circle of guests. My chair felt a little harder when I sat back down. Across the table, one of Dad's colleagues, a tall man with a deep voice and a face like a weathered brick, leaned toward me. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "The rest of us know what real work looks like." I gave a nod, grateful for the words, though they did little to shake the dull burn in my chest. The evening moved along. Toasts, dances, photo ops. I kept my distance. Made small talk when necessary. No one asked what I'd been up to. No one noticed when I slipped away for air. Outside, the terrace was empty. String lights glowed softly above, casting long shadows over the stone floor. I leaned on the railing and looked out at the city, its lights humming in the distance. I thought about the centers, the kids, The wiring diagram still sitting on my desk back home. I thought about Grace, about Peter, about the email from that kid who wanted to come back and teach. Inside they had chandeliers. Outside I had silence. And somehow it felt more real. I stepped back inside after a few minutes just as the first course was being cleared. My seat at table 3 was between two men with watches worth more than my car. They were talking about a biotech startup going public, something about IPOs and seed capital. I nodded politely when they acknowledged me, then turned my attention to the water glass in front of me. Across the table, Dad was holding court. A cluster of men in tailored suits leaned in as he described a recent real estate flip in Phoenix. "Market's ripe if you know where to look," he said. "Timing is everything." One of them raised his glass. "To Thomas Bennett, still calling shots better than any of us." I watched the way Dad accepted the praise, like he expected it, like it was just the natural order of things. A crash interrupted the rhythm of the evening. A young server no older than 20 had tripped near our table, sending a tray of champagne flutes clattering to the floor. Liquid splashed across the tile. Shards sparkled under the lights. She looked mortified, cheeks red, hands trembling as she tried to scoop up broken glass with a napkin. No one moved. I stood and crouched beside her. "Let me help." She hesitated, then nodded. I grabbed a few fresh linens from a side table and helped mop up the spill. One of the groomsmen muttered something under his breath. Another chuckled. "Looks like someone's working the wrong side of the wedding." Someone else added, "Hey, isn't he in security or something? Probably feels right at home." Laughter bubbled around the table. I didn't react. I helped the girl to her feet, handed her the last few shards wrapped in cloth. "You're okay. Don't worry about them." She whispered a thank you and disappeared toward the kitchen. When I sat back down, Dad leaned over with a smirk. "Always the hero, huh? Or maybe just really committed to the blue-collar aesthetic." He turned to the group. "This is my younger son, Lucas. He's an engineer of sorts. Installs security cameras in public housing projects. Important work, right?" The others chuckled politely. One of them asked if I had any tips on how to keep raccoons out of his garage. I smiled faintly, said nothing. Dad didn't notice or didn't care. He went on to tell a story about Derek's law firm winning a massive class action case. The men listened with admiration. Derek arrived halfway through, catching just enough to bask in the applause. I picked at my plate. The room felt louder, my seat smaller, but I stayed. For Mom. Because she asked. Because showing up was the one thing they couldn't spin or ignore. Later, when the band struck up a slower tune and couples moved to the dance floor, I slipped back out onto the terrace. The stars had come out, sparse but steady, like small truths in a noisy room. I heard the tap of polished shoes before I saw him. Peter Langford didn't belong here, not among Derek's circle or Charlotte's curated guest list. But there he was, standing at the entrance to the terrace, hands in the pockets of a charcoal coat, eyes scanning the crowd like he already knew where everyone stood. I raised an eyebrow and stepped forward. "Didn't expect to see you here." He shrugged, a familiar half-smile on his face. "Charlotte invited me. Apparently she did a piece on one of our centers last year." Recognized my name on the board. I didn't know whether to laugh or brace for what was coming. He stepped up beside me, looking out at the skyline. "You look like you're doing well. Depends on your definition." He chuckled. "There it is." A waiter passed by with a tray of bourbon. Peter took 2 glasses and handed me one. "I heard what happened at your table," he said. I didn't ask how. Peter always had ways of knowing things. Don't let them reduce you to what they understand. That's not your problem. Inside, someone tapped a microphone. The crowd quieted. Charlotte's voice floated through the speakers, thanking everyone for attending. Then she said something unexpected. "Before we begin the first dance, we have a special guest who'd like to say a few words." I looked at Peter. "What did you do?" He finished his drink in one motion, then walked in without answering. I followed, heart thudding. Peter took the stage with the calm of a seasoned speaker. He smiled at the couple, offered congratulations, then turned to the guests. "Most of you know me as the chairman of the Langford Foundation," he began. "Over the last 5 years, we've expanded initiatives across the state focused on education, rehabilitation, and workforce development." He paused, letting the room settle. But none of those projects would have existed without one key contribution. 5 years ago, an anonymous donor came to me with a simple request. He wanted to change lives quietly. No headlines, no plaques, just real work. I stood at the back of the room. Every breath felt heavier. Peter continued. "That donation, $1 million, funded 3 centers, trained over 200 young people, and helped build futures where none existed. Tonight I want to break that anonymity, not to embarrass but to honor." He turned, looked straight at me. "Lucas Bennett, stand up, please." The room froze. All heads turned. I didn't move. Peter smiled gently. "You've done more good than most of us could hope to in a lifetime. It's time people knew." I rose slowly. The silence felt infinite, then a wave of murmurs, then applause. Derek looked stunned. Charlotte blinked, mouth slightly open. Dad's expression was unreadable. Peter stepped down, walked past me, clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, and I nodded. I didn't sit back down, not yet. I stood there while the applause grew, not raucous but steady, respectful, some of it surprised, most of it genuine. For the first time all night, no one looked through me. I caught Derek's eyes across the room. His jaw was tight, mouth a hard line. Charlotte leaned in, whispering something sharp. Her expression didn't carry confusion, just disbelief, like the math didn't add up. That guy Thomas still hadn't moved. He held his wine glass midair, eyes locked on Peter, then me. I couldn't read his face, not anger, not pride, something in between, edged with discomfort. Peter returned to his seat like nothing had happened. The MC fumbled with the mic, trying to pull the evening back to its scheduled joy. "We now invite the bride and groom to the dance floor." Music swelled. Derek and Charlotte stepped forward, all smiles again, though hers cracked at the edges. The crowd followed, laughter louder than before, as if to compensate. I finally sat, hands resting on the tablecloth. My heart was still racing. I felt warm under the collar. A woman I didn't recognize approached from another table. "Mr. Bennett," she asked, "I just wanted to say thank you. My nephew went through one of those centers in El Paso. He's finishing high school now. Got his first job last week." I smiled. "That's great to hear. He did the hard part." She gripped my shoulder lightly, then moved on. Another man came up, then a couple. Quiet thank yous. Handshakes. Nothing flashy, just people who had been listening. For a moment I let it settle in. Dad didn't say a word, didn't look my way, but his circle grew quieter, their posture a little more rigid. Whatever narrative he had been spinning about me didn't hold anymore. Peter was talking to someone across the room. I could see him gesture toward me once, then let it go. He didn't need to do more. The point had landed. When I glanced toward Derek, he wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at his drink, jaw tight. Charlotte kept glancing over, her curiosity poorly hidden. They were recalibrating, trying to make sense of a version of me they hadn't accounted for. I didn't gloat, didn't speak, just sat, breathing it in. Peter's words still rang in my head. The value isn't in how prestigious your title is, it's in who benefits from your work. That stuck with people. Because it was true. And finally, they had heard it from someone they respected. The music played on, but the room had changed. Not just in volume or energy, but in tone. It was subtler, quieter, like everyone was holding something new in the back of their minds. I glanced toward the head table. Thomas was still there, still seated, but now staring fixedly at the centerpiece like it might offer an escape. He hadn't looked at me since Peter's speech. Not even once. Julia was wiping at her eyes with a napkin. She didn't try to hide it. She looked at me across the room and gave a nod that meant more than any words. Grace stood farther back near the bar. She hadn't approached, hadn't said anything, just watched. Calm, thoughtful, a small smile that didn't demand to be noticed. I stayed in my seat a few minutes longer, letting the crowd settle. A few more people stopped by, but the rush had passed. I didn't need more than that. I didn't need the spotlight. Eventually, I slipped away, through a side door and out toward the garden behind the venue. It was quieter there. A string of soft lights hung along the fence and patches of wildflowers leaned in the breeze. A boy stood near a tree, maybe 10 or 11, holding a plate of untouched cake. He looked out of place in his too big dress shirt and loosened tie. "Hey," I said gently. "Mind if I join you?" He looked up, startled, then nodded. I sat on the low stone wall beside him. "You hiding out too?" He shrugged. "My parents are dancing. I don't like dancing." "Fair enough." He kicked at the dirt with his shoe. "You're the guy who gave the money, right? The one the old man talked about?" I raised an eyebrow. "Depends who you ask." He looked at me sideways. "Why'd you do it? Because people needed a shot. And I could give them one." The boy thought about that. "That's cool. What's your name, Eli? You got a dream, Eli." He nodded. "I want to be an architect. Build houses where people can see the stars from every room." "That's a good dream." "You think I can?" I smiled. "Yeah, I think you can." He didn't say anything else, just smiled back and took a bite of his cake. We sat like that for a while. The music from the reception drifted faintly through the trees. For the first time all night, I felt still. I didn't need applause, or recognition, or even forgiveness. Peace was enough. The quiet stretched on, and I stayed where I was. The breeze stirred the string lights above me, casting soft glows across the garden wall. The boy Eli had wandered back inside, cake gone and resolve restored. I thought I'd be alone the rest of the night. But then I heard footsteps. Not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. Thomas appeared at the edge of the path, his jacket draped over one arm. His tie loosened at the collar. For a second, he looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong memory. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there looking at me. Then he walked over and sat on the low wall a few feet away. I wasn't sure who should speak first. He cleared his throat. "You know, when you were born, I didn't know what to do with you." He looked down at his hands. "You were quiet. Derek cried all the time, needed everything loud, but you just stared, like you were already thinking bigger than the room." I didn't answer. I got scared, I think, of not knowing how to reach you, so I stopped trying. Just leaned into what I understood. Structure, achievement, the things that made sense to me. He exhaled slow. "That was wrong. I kept my eyes on the garden. I didn't need you to get it, just to see me." He flinched like I'd struck him, but didn't look away. "I do now," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry it took this long." I let the words sit between us. For once there was no anger left in them. Just weight, real and overdue. He looked toward the string lights. "You didn't have to do any of it, the money, the work, but you did. And you did it without ever asking for credit. That's something I'll never be able to explain to anyone the way it deserves." I shook my head. It wasn't about explaining. It was about doing. He nodded slowly. I don't expect anything from you, Lucas. I just wanted to say, I see you now, for who you are, and I'm proud. The word caught in his throat like it had never been used on me before. He stood up awkwardly like he wasn't sure if he should stay. Before he turned to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Not heavy, not forced, just there. And for the first time in a long time, I let it be. No fireworks, no speeches, just something soft and maybe honest. Then he walked back toward the light. I stayed in the garden a while longer, long after the lights in it began to dim and the hum of conversation faded into the night. The sound of plates being cleared and laughter thinning out told me the celebration was winding down. A breeze picked up cooler now, brushing past my collar. I closed my eyes and let it pass. For so many years I had tried to outrun the ache of not being seen, of being measured against someone else's idea of success. Tonight had shifted something, maybe not in the world, but in me. Eventually I stood and made my way back to the venue. Most of the guests had gone. Staff moved quietly, collecting glasses, folding linens. I nodded to one of them, a young woman with tired eyes. She smiled back. Inside, Julia stood near the entrance, coat over her arm. She turned as I approached, her eyes still red. You were incredible tonight, she said, reaching up to smooth my jacket like I was a child again. Thanks, Mom. He talked to you? Yeah, she exhaled. Good. He needed to. We stood for a moment, not needing more words. Then she kissed my cheek and said, Come by tomorrow. I'll make pancakes. I smiled. That sounds perfect. As I walked out to the parking lot, I saw Grace leaning against her car. She wasn't waiting for me, not exactly, but she didn't leave either. You clean up well? She said. I laughed. You always did like me in a tie. She stepped closer. So, mystery man, $1 million benefactor, what's next? I looked up at the night sky. Maybe something small, maybe something quiet, but whatever it is, it's mine. She smiled, not saying anything, just standing there beside me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to explain anything. We got in our cars and drove off in opposite directions. But something about the road ahead felt different. Not fixed, but open. And that was enough. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove through the quiet streets of Austin, letting the night settle around me. I rolled the windows down halfway, letting the cool air cut through the remnants of the day's heat. There was no rush, nothing urgent waiting for me. Just the soft hum of the road and the distant glow of streetlights. The weight I had carried for years felt different. Not gone, but shifted. Less like a burden, more like a scar that no longer hurt to touch. I passed by the old community center where I had helped install the first set of security cameras. It looked different now, with fresh paint, new signage, and a sense of safety. A couple of teenagers were sitting on the front steps, laughing quietly, sharing earbuds. I wondered if they knew what this place used to be, or what it could have been without the second chance it had been given. At a red light, I glanced at my phone. Another message from Peter. The board voted tonight. Your program's being expanded statewide. I let out a quiet breath. One more step forward. One more piece of something bigger than myself. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered again, still waiting. I left it alone, walked inside, set down my keys, and let the stillness wrap around me. There was no crowd, no spotlight, just the echo of my own choices. I poured a glass of water, stepped into the backyard. The stars were scattered more clearly here, away from the noise of the city. I let my mind drift back to the boy at the wedding. Eli, his questions, his quiet hope. That was the part I held on to. I didn't need my father's apology to validate the work I'd done, but having it helped, like a crack letting light in. I remembered Grace's smile as we stood beside our cars. I didn't know if that was something that would circle back or remain a moment frozen in time. Either way, I had no regrets. The past didn't need to define the future. It only needed to inform it. The next morning I woke before sunrise, made pancakes just like Mom used to. Thought about dropping by her place later. Maybe I would, or maybe I'd just call. Her voice was enough to bring a sense of home. Before I left for work, I sat on the edge of the bed looking at an old photo, me and Derek side by side as kids standing in front of our childhood home. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb, then placed it back in the drawer. The past didn't need to be erased, just reframed. At the office, the morning was quiet. The team trickled in with coffee and soft chatter. I reviewed plans for our next community project scheduled in a neighborhood not far from where I grew up. Full circle. Around midday, a letter arrived from a student in one of our training programs. He said he used to think his life would only go one way until someone believed he was worth investing in. He wrote about dreams, about second chances, about gratitude. He didn't know my name. That part was still confidential. Didn't matter, because the work mattered, because the kid mattered. That's all I'd ever wanted. Later that week, I got a message from Grace. Just a simple line, "Coffee sometime." I stared at it for a moment. Then typed back, "I'd like that." We don't all get standing ovations. Some of us just get quiet moments that remind us we were right to stay the course, that choosing kindness, persistence, and quiet resilience still counts. If you've ever felt like you were on the outside looking in, if you've been told you weren't enough, that your voice didn't matter, you're not alone, and you don't need to be loud to leave a mark. I'd love to hear your story, because maybe someone else needs to hear it too.